Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminally, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today I'm done. I've finished my Disturbing Books project. So people who've been watching the channel for a while will know that this project was kicked off by my review of this book, Notice by Heather Lewis. So I did a review of this back in the summer of 2022, which quickly became my most successful video and is still my most successful video ever. So the YouTube algorithm picked it up, tons of people watched that video, and I got tons of comments from people recommending other disturbing books. So what I did in the wake of that was start this project where I've been reading not all but many of the books that were suggested in those comments. I've read, I think, over 30 books for the project now, and I've now finished it. I've read all the books I wanted to, so I thought I would come back and talk about the final 5. What will happen next after this is I will be doing at some point a Disturbing Books tier ranking video, where I'll talk about all the disturbing books that I've read that I can remember. So it'll be, the 30 that I've read, or 30 odd I've read for this project, plus more. So I think that will definitely be over 50 books. So look out for that coming soon, but it's a bit of an undertaking. So I need to plan that properly and get prepared for it. Of course, the most important thing that's happened during the time of the Disturbing Books project, apart from me reading tons of disturbing books, is that Notice has been republished. So when I reviewed it, I'd managed to get hold of this tatty old copy from eBay. The book was out of print, but in the wake of the success of that video, I contacted Serpent's Tail, the publisher in the UK, and said, I think you should consider republishing this book. And wonderfully, they have done that. So this new edition came out a couple of months ago. I know a number of people have picked it up and read it as a result of that. So I'm really delighted that Notice is out there in the wild again, because I think it's a really good book and a really important book, as well as being hugely disturbing. So let me crack on and talk to you in this video about the final 5 books I've read then for the project. And what I also wanted to do at the end was just touch on another topic that kind of relates to this, which is disturbing books versus disturbing films. So let me start then with the 5 books. So the first of those that I want to talk about is The Kindly Ones by Jonathan Littell. So this was recommended by a few people in the comments. And it's not the kind of book I normally read. This is a huge book. It's nearly 1,000 pages long, and it's a book that is translated. So it was originally published in French. And it was quite an experience. It's a book about the Second World War, told from the perspective of someone who was an SS officer, and he's now looking back on the events of the war and kind of in his mind recreating those events and justifying his own part in some atrocities. So, I mean, some horrific detail in this book. But what comes across more than anything from it is the way that people can justify terrible actions to themselves. So it was definitely disturbing. It was also fascinating. I really, really liked this book a lot. It was a book that I just was completely immersed in during the time that I read it. And I read it over quite a long period of time because it is so long and so troubling at times. But I really do think it's a fantastic book and definitely worth reading. The next book I wanted to talk about then is another book that is in translation. This is The Melting by Lize, which I think was originally published in Dutch. So this is a really interesting book, and this is a book that really took off in its home country when it was published, and got an international edition off the back of that. And the same is true of The Kindly Ones. So that won a literary award in France, and subsequently was translated into English. This is a really interesting book in terms of the way it handles its disturbing content. And the thing that is really effective about this book is that it kind of juxtaposes really disturbing stuff with really everyday stuff. So it's about this small town. There's this group of kids who are friends who start daring basically other kids in the town to do like weird and unpleasant things, and they do that. They've got this riddle that they kind of put to people, and if people can't get the answer to the riddle, they have to do a forfeit basically, which become increasingly disturbing things as the book progresses. But against that, background of like kids being mean to each other, basically, you've also got just really everyday family stuff, a lot of which was kind of quite nostalgic. I think the book's set in the early 90s, so you get a lot of stuff about kind of the early days of the internet and, you know, families sharing computers and things like that, which was kind of almost like cozy to read. So you've got, you know, the juxtaposition of really, really horrific, disturbing stuff with like really kind of nice family stuff, and that makes the disturbing stuff even more effective in some ways. So it's not like something like Notice, which is just completely unrelenting in its bleakness. So I thought it was very interesting that Lize made that choice. There is one scene in this book in particular towards the end which still is one of the most disturbing things I've ever read. Just an absolutely horrific scene. And that, I think, is probably what's got this book its reputation, that one scene in particular. But yeah, overall, a really effective book, a really interesting book, and I did enjoy it. Next up, then, one I didn't enjoy nearly as much, and that is Pretty Girls by Karin Slaughter. So Karin Slaughter is an author I've read a few books by, and I think she's a really good author of kind of suspense fiction, kind of thriller type books. Best known for her long-running Grant County series, I think, which is about her like a forensic pathologist. Pretty Girls is a standalone, so not a book that's in one of her series, and it's a book that loads of people recommended. And I suspect that lots of people recommended this because she's a popular author. This is a book that probably quite a lot of people have read as a result of that. And whilst her other books that I've read, like the Grant County books, because they're about forensics, they are quite graphic. They're not disturbing in the same way that Pretty Girls is. So Pretty Girls is about a woman who discovers, after her husband has died, she discovers in his possession some snuff movies, basically. And it's about her trying to figure out what's gone on. So you see the detail, you get to read the detail of these snuff movies. And it is, disturbing stuff. But what, for me, bogged the book down is like this long, convoluted thriller type plot with loads of twists and turns, some of which worked, a lot of which didn't, in my opinion. So overall, I found that completely diluted the impact of the stuff in the book that was quite disturbing, because it just gets lost in all this kind of mess of plot detail. So that is one that didn't particularly work for me, but I can see why some people had suggested it, because, as I say, there's definitely some disturbing material in there, and I think it's kind of a level above Karin Slaughter's other books in terms of that disturbingness. So I can see why people who are maybe fans of hers and who'd read that thought it was particularly disturbing. So finishing off then, I've got two books which, again, like the kindly ones and the Melting, kind of have a connection. So those books are Tampa by Alyssa Nutting and My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. So these are both books that are about child abuse, and they are both books with a female protagonist. The difference being that in Tampa, the female protagonist is the abuser, and in My Dark Vanessa, the female protagonist is the victim. So I thought it was really interesting to read two books that have a female character at their centre that are about abuse and that approach it in such different ways. And they are very different. So My Dark Vanessa feels a lot more kind of literary, for want of a better word. Tampa, whilst it has been praised in literary circles, is structured more like a thriller. So it's got a very linear plot, and it's about this woman. She's a teacher who very deliberately plans the abuse of some of her male pupils, and the kind of build up to that, her plotting of that, what then happens. And the implications of that, and there are some quite kind of almost like thrillery twists to the plot in terms of her trying to keep what she's doing secret, and the constant threat of kind of people finding out, basically, which is essentially the plot. You could use that plot, or you could describe the plot of many thrillers as that thing: someone doing something wrong and then trying to cover it up. And it is definitely a gripping book. It is definitely disturbing. It has very graphic sexual detail in it, which many people will not want to read. And overall, it was one of those books where at the end of it, I couldn't decide if I thought it was really interesting and good or just kind of trashy. And I think it's probably a bit of both. And maybe that's okay. Maybe a book, can be both those things and have merit. So it's definitely a book I've thought about since I finished reading it. And it's definitely an effective book, and all the more disturbing because it's based on true events. It's based on a true case that happened in Florida. So My Dark Vanessa, by contrast, then has the female protagonist is the victim, and again it's a student teacher kind of style of abuse, if you like. So in this book, she is a pupil at a boarding school. I think she's 15 when the abuse starts, and one of her teachers, her English teacher, basically seduces her and starts abusing her. And the book is set so unlike Tampa, which has like a linear plot, My Dark Vanessa skips about a lot in terms of like the time frame of different scenes. So a lot of the book is with her as an adult looking back on what's happened. And the thing that is disturbing about My Dark Vanessa is that she's still in contact with her abuser. She kind of doesn't really consider it to have been abuse, but he's now been accused of abuse by another girl from the school. And so it's all kind of stirred up again and all in the limelight again. So a really interesting book. I didn't find it as gripping as Tampa. So Tampa is, as I said, kind of has this kind of thriller feel to it, and so is quite compelling. My Dark Vanessa is really, really interesting and very thoughtful. I think it's more thoughtful than Tampa, and very kind of reflective on the nature of abuse. So again, a really, really interesting book. But I think overall, Tampa was the one that gripped me more, despite the fact that I have more reservations about how good a book it is, if that makes sense. So yeah, those are the final 5 books that I've read for this project, and as I say, I will be doing a tier ranking video before too long, probably in the next month or two, where I'll talk briefly about all the disturbing books I've read. So finally, then, I wanted to talk quickly about disturbing films versus disturbing books, and the reason for this is one of the videos I've made as part of this project was talking about the 120 Days of Sodom by the Marquis de Sade. And loads of people, so that is a very graphic, very disturbing book. Definitely not a book I recommend people reading, partly because it's really disturbing, but partly because it's also just kind of boring. Loads of people have commented on that video to say, have I seen the movie Salo, the 120 Days of Sodom, directed by the Italian director Pasolini? And the answer to that is no. So I am someone who... there's kind of I don't know if this is a contradiction in my character or not, but I definitely am drawn to reading disturbing fiction. There's something about seeing the darker side of life in disturbing books, which I find fascinating. And I think it's important that that we do acknowledge the darker side of humanity sometimes, and stare at it and reflect on it. But I don't like watching really graphic, disturbing films. Now, I do enjoy horror movies, but I don't enjoy like nasty films, if that makes sense. And I'm someone who, when I was a teenager, I was definitely into, quote unquote extreme cinema and the idea of disturbing films. And I remember reading an essay back then which listed like what the author considered to be the 10 most disturbing films of all time, and one of those films was Salo. So back then, when it was completely impossible to get a copy of it, this is back in the 90s, completely impossible to get a copy of it in the UK, well, certainly impossible for me, I was kind of fascinated by the idea of this film and other films on that list as well. But now, as an adult, where I could get a copy of it, I have no desire to see it at all. I have no desire to see visually that kind of disturbing stuff. And I don't know what that is. It's something about the way my brain processes stuff, I suppose, that I find like watching something horrific and disturbing much more difficult to take than reading it. And I think it's maybe it's something about just being able to put a book down. And I know you can pause a movie, you can stop watching a movie, but it feels somehow different to me. There's something about the act of closing a book and putting it aside that gives you a kind of almost immediate closure. And the events of a book and the things you've read about in the book may stick with you, and may linger with you. But for me, there's something about seeing something that is more impactful and stays with me more, and stays with me in a way that I don't like. Which isn't to say that I like being disturbed by disturbing books, but I do find it an interesting experience. But yeah, disturbing movies are just, nowadays, as I've got older, are just too much for me. And I've had, for example, a copy I bought like probably 20, it may even be 20 years ago. I bought a copy of the French film Irreversible on DVD, which is, a famously disturbing film. And it sounds like an interesting film, and it's a film that's told backwards. I've never watched it. I've never been able to bring myself to watch it. So yeah, there's something about disturbing films that just doesn't work for me. And I still remember, and maybe this is part of the reason for it, my kind of, well, one of the most impactful cinema going experiences of my life, still, and this happened when I was probably 17, I want to say 17 or 18, maybe even younger, maybe it was 16, was seeing the movie Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer in a cinema in Cambridge. So it was part of a film festival, and they had got, I don't even know if the film had been, I think it was before it had been certified in the UK, so it hadn't been looked at by the BBFC, the British Board of Film Classification, who rate films and can insist on cuts being made to films before they can be publicly shown. I think because this was part of a film festival, they were able to get permission to show a film that hadn't been classified. So this was like the full uncut version of the film, and it was shown in the at like the midnight show, like the 11 o'clock show. So I and a group of my friends, all of whom were into horror movies and all of whom had heard of this film, we'd read about it in Fangoria or wherever, went to see it with what was, I think, largely an unsuspecting audience. So Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, if you don't know, is a very graphic, very disturbing film about the serial killer Henry Lee Lucas, which is just completely unflinching. But it was marketed, like the poster kind of marketed it as more like a kind of slasher movie. It made references to like Freddy and Jason on the poster. So I think there were a ton of people in that audience who just were not expecting it. They were expecting a horror movie, and whilst it is a horror movie, it's not like a normal horror movie. I think at least a third, if not half of the audience walked out during the screening. And at one point, someone who got up to walk out turned round and punched the guy who was sitting next to him. So this guy, who I think was probably drunk or stoned or something like that, had been like giggling at parts in the film. There were moments in the film where the audience were so shocked by what was happening on screen that there was kind of that kind of nervous laughter, like people just didn't know what to how to take it. But this one guy had been doing that more than other people. And this guy, when he got out to leave with his girlfriend, turned around and punched the guy in the face. So it was a very intense cinema-going experience, shall we say. And I think that was probably kind of, I think it had a lasting impact on me in terms of my ability to watch disturbing films. But yeah, clearly not on my ability to read disturbing books. So anyway, that was a bit of a waffle about disturbing movies at the end there. But yeah, hopefully you found this project as interesting as I have. And as I say, I will return with a tier ranking video at some point. But yeah, let me know in the comments any disturbing books you've read recently. And as always, thanks very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.